Seeing as Stranger Things Season 3 is right around the corner, I thought I would finally publish my Let's Binge Watch video of Stranger Things Season 2, and keep in mind that I filmed most of this video last year. I just never got around to editing the whole thing, as these videos take a lot of time to make. So with that said, let's get this binge watch started. So the episode starts off feeling more like an episode of a superhero show where some robbers are getting away and one of them uses her powers to stop the cops. After we see the slightly altered opening title, we are taken right back to our main characters. All of them. And that is what was really nice about this episode. Before fully setting the plot into motion, it gives us time to spend with the characters that we have grown to love over the course of the first season. Mike and Nancy have another nice mischievous brother and sister moment, the kids go to the arcade and play Dragon's Lair, and watching them react to their losses was really hilarious. Especially when Dustin is on the receiving end of it. He was my favourite character from the first season, and that still remains true after watching this episode. And watching the rest of the main characters return, such as the new Hellboy himself and Winona Ryder, was great. The same with Jonathan and even Steve, the reformed ex-bully. Seeing all of them again is so welcome. I was also really surprised to see Sean Astin added to the cast. I completely forgot that he was meant to be in here. And in his first scene, he has a bloody extended kissing scene with Winona Ryder. Really not the best opening for an actor of his caliber, and in my opinion, they really need to make up for this. We also have another new character called Max, and she seems interesting. Not enough information has been given about her thus far, so we will just have to wait and see what her purpose is in the upcoming episodes. It was also interesting to see that Bob, from the first season, is still being searched for by her parents. Usually when someone is missing but has not been presumed dead, a movie or show just completely ignores them. So it was good to see the show at least reference her. And I think I know why they referenced it. Right after we finished watching this episode, my sister told me that Bob has actually become a fan favourite and that there has been hashtags called Bring Back Bob or something. And honestly, I am of the opposite opinion. I was so glad that they got rid of Bob. In the first season, we had Nancy going on about her boyfriend, and to me, Bob came off like a lesbian in the way she was acting like she had her friend's best interests in mind, when really she just didn't want her to hook up with her boyfriend because that damages her chances. And I did not want another layer of romance added to this show. The last thing we needed at this point was a love triangle of sorts. So right at that moment, I wished she would go. And I got my wish. Moving swiftly on, what are my final thoughts on this episode? Well, it hasn't gotten me as intrigued as the first episode of Season 1 did, but that being said, as a continuation, it can't unfold plot points like the first season did. It was primarily meant to show us how our characters are dealing with the really heavy events of the first season, and it does a good job in that regard. But as an overall episode, I don't think I would want to watch it again. It's an episode you can only see once, and that's it. The end scene with Elle was interesting though, and I am curious to see where it leads. Alright, so episode 2 opens with Eleven, and apparently she has been in a state of hibernation for a very long time. She finally wakes up and is scared out of her mind, and seeing Elle at her most vulnerable is when her character is the most interesting to watch, as it provides great tension and it hopefully gives her the opportunity to stand up for herself and further develop her abilities. Which is exactly what she does, and quite surprisingly, she finds her way to Mike. And this happens all in the opening scene before the credits. I didn't expect that. And then we are taken back to our main characters, and the opening scene with the boys all dressed up in their Ghostbusters costumes and getting their pictures taken was hilarious. The humour has always been a strong point in Stranger Things, and I am glad to see that Season 2 is still going strong in this department. Also, watching Hellboy here all happy is nice. That's not something we see from him very often. There are also some curious stuff, such as Max and her relationship and past with what seems to be her brother here, but we are just being given hints at this point. The main continuing plot of this episode, other than the awakening of Elle, is the anticipated threat of Will's visions. And I really like the visual that a big alien monster shows up from the sky. That's kind of what I thought was going to happen in Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds, judging by its poster, but unfortunately we never got that visual. But we do in here, and I am so glad to finally see something bring this creepy imagery to fruition. Going back to Will's visions, I gotta admit, I'm tolerating them, but if they happen one more time without a different payoff, then they are just being dragged out. One thing that did come of this though, is that Will finally tells Mike about them. So that was something, although I don't get why Will says that he doesn't want the others to know because they won't understand. On the contrary, if anyone would understand, it's his friends. They have witnessed and experienced all of this crazy stuff in the first season. You tell them anything at this point and they'll believe it. So that felt kind of unnecessary and thoughtless to me. Also, we are 2 episodes in and Bob here has done nothing. In fact, he is starting to get a little annoying. That being said, he must be someone from an agency because from the show's production standpoint, you don't hire a well-known actor like this and have him play this lame and petty character. So I bet he will soon betray our main characters in some fashion. Also, I'll finish with this. The ending of this episode was one of the most strangest notes to ever end an episode on. But in a way, it does get you to put on the next episode right away. So we move on to episode 3, and it opens with Dustin trying to tell his friends during class that he has found something. And as always, Dustin is hilarious. I always look forward to watching the show give him some comedic scenes. And it turns out that what was in Dustin's garbage was a little monster. Now pretty much immediately, I was expecting this thing to be what Will vomited out in the end of the last season. And it turns out that it is. And the rest of the kids wisely decide to kill it, whereas Dustin wants to protect it as if he can vouch for its innocence. And I think he is pretty stupid for that. I mean, I understand the mentality that a kid would want to protect a helpless and cute looking pet, stroke creature, but this thing is clearly from another world, and assuming that it's harmless and a good guy is quite stupid given it's obviously going to appear like that during its infancy. When it grows bigger, it is clearly going to be a problem. But to be honest, I kind of knew that he was going to get this protective over it. How? Well, because he named it.
You're not supposed to name it.
Once you name it, you start getting attached to it. Now put that thing back where it came from, or so help me!
Nancy and Steve are also having problems with their relationship due to a drunk yet credible confession, and yeah, it's kind of stating the obvious. Since season 1, the show has clearly shown that she and Jonathan are the ones that are going to end up together, so there's no surprise there. Also, the scene where Hellboy is reading Elle a story and she finds out that she doesn't have a mother was a rather tragic and heartfelt moment. This episode really did dive into Elle's thought process a lot more, and I liked that. But more importantly, the developing threat that Will is witnessing with his visions has somehow come through on the camcorder, and it was a pretty cool and intense scene. It could have been filmed and directed a lot better and more intense, but for what it was okay. In regards to my complaints for this episode, there really were none. It just had an inconsistent pace is all, and that can be a really bad thing, but it was okay. The episode eventually picked up and then the pacing really advanced, and it ended on one hell of a cliffhanger. So yeah, I can't wait to watch the next episode and see what happens. Wow. This episode of Stranger Things had the best opening scene before cutting to the opening credits. Amazingly intense opening. Anyway, there is a lot to talk about with this episode, but I'm going to try and condense it as much as I can. First off, we actually see Elle and Hopper have their first heated argument. Elle left the house in the previous episode and has been discovered, so as you can imagine, Hopper is really pissed off. And watching their dynamic take a turn like this is very interesting and entertaining to witness. It was also cool to see Elle have a tantrum with her powers, and not pass out like she was pretty much throughout the whole of season 1. Don't get me wrong, it was understandable, but it's about time that she uses her powers without paying for it later. Also, the connection between Will and his mum is really endearing. It seems like a very real and sincere connection they both have, and relaying that in a visual medium is not easy, so props to the writers, directors, and actors for portraying these genuine relationships on screen. Will lying to his mother for some unknown reason, however, really bothered me, and I was glad to see that it was bothering his mum too. She basically told him to cut the crap in her own way, and then he fessed up and told her what was really going on. Moving away from dumb character traits, the little kid actor, Noah Schnapp, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, playing Will is really talented. He was crying and portraying his fear very convincingly. Seeing as we didn't see him in season 1 very much, I didn't have much of an input on his acting ability, but he is really good. It's just his poor decision making, but let's not tread over old ground. Anyway, Mike reveals Will's situation to the rest of the team, and whilst all of this is going on, Nancy and Jonathan are going about their own little investigation, and it turns out that they want to destroy the lab that houses the portal to the Upside Down. But they get captured pretty quickly, it must be said. But in a twist, it turns out that they wanted to get captured, so we'll see where that goes. Dustin is also still attending to his new pet, which is not so little anymore. That little booger has become a big monster now, and it even leaves his skin behind very much like the xenomorph does in Alien. And the scene where it was eating the cat, I swear, it seems like it took direct inspiration from The Amazing Spider-Man. You know, the scene where the infected rat is eating the normal rat. Of all things to take inspiration from, The Amazing Spider-Man? Seriously. Well, okay, I will admit that was one of its better scenes. Also, Will draws pictures of what he sees in his visions, and the show almost tried to make a mystery of what he was drawing, but thankfully they figured out pretty quickly that he is drawing pieces of a bigger picture. As for cons in this episode, there really were none. Again, it felt a bit slow at parts, and a couple of the characters that I have already mentioned make some questionable and stupid choices, but on the whole, I didn't really have any complaints. Also, Max's not brother, I'm just gonna say it, this guy is a freak. When he's not tormenting Max, he keeps taking his shirt off whenever he's at school and going up in Steve's face. And it's clear that he thinks he's being super intimidating this way. He really comes off as a nut job. And finally, the ending where Hellboy— okay, I swear this is the last time I will call him that. But to my understanding, he finds another way to the Upside Down through the ground, and that's where the episode ends. So I will see what happens and get back to you in the next episode. Well, holy shit. Hopper seems to have been knocked out by this monster's farts or something and is now trapped here, and no one knows where he is. These guys really need to have an alibi or someone who can account for their whereabouts rather than just going out on their own. Anyway, the episode opens and you find out that this is one of the most insane pictures put together to form a puzzle. I mean, this is comically insane. Also, in this episode, we learn about Elle's backstory and how she was born and got separated from her mother. Cutting to present time, Elle, or Jane as we discover, actually gets to see her mother, but what she sees isn't what she bargained for. Speaking of which, Will has also seen Hopper in the tunnel, and now his mum and Mike are trying to find him before he dies or something. No pressure. Oh, and apparently Bob is now conveniently called Bob the Brain and can help them locate Hopper. They eventually find him, and I gotta say, this episode ended in both a relief and an intense way. Wow, this episode opens up and right from the get-go is pretty damn horrifying. So Will has this mental and physical connection to the Upside Down, and as parts of it get destroyed, Will feels immense pain. And the more they destroy, the more pain Will feels until he ultimately dies. So in other words, our characters have the tools necessary to kill the threat, but they can't do it because they will kill Will. So they decide to run some tests on him and see just what is causing this link. And Joyce, who is an infuriated mother, reacts to these incompetent doctors very convincingly. And in the meantime, our main characters talk to Will, and it just so happens that he has forgotten about Bob as well, which is interesting. But then we find out that he's forgotten pretty much everyone. The scene where they're trying to talk and test Will's mental fidelity is both intriguing and intense. Now, using his connection, Will finds a blind spot in the Upside Down, an area that the monster mysteriously does not want him to see. So they figure out that it must be the monster's weak spot, but it turns out—
it's a trap!
Yes, it's a trap. All the while, the rest of the characters are trying to set up a trap to stop the little Demogorgon, and somehow it has managed to duplicate itself, which is very odd. I do hope they explain that. Also, I really think that this little monster is going to tie into a much bigger picture. I mean, it would be quite a waste if it didn't amount to anything. And by the way, who would have thought that we would end up watching Dustin and Steve team up? And I gotta say, pretty much instantly, they make a hilarious duo. The way they react to one another and the constant witty dialogue they spew out is downright hilarious. Also, quite interestingly, I did notice that Elle wasn't really in this episode much, and I can imagine that when she gets involved, they will all be safe, but until then, she really seems to be embarking on her own journey while the rest of the characters are dealing with their own problems. Hopper also attempts to talk to Elle through his communications device, and watching him be this emotionally vulnerable is not something we have seen from him very often. And as for negatives, there were no negatives. This was a great episode, and it was very nicely paced. I enjoyed it from beginning to end, and now that shit is really starting to go down, I can't wait to see what happens next. So despite the last episode having an awesome cliffhanger, this episode opens with Elle going on a mission of self-discovery. Yep, instead of continuing with this, we are doing this. And what does Elle learn? Nothing she couldn't have figured out herself. So my question is, why the hell are we going on this pointless detour, and which numbskull approved it? In this episode, there is apparently another girl that has similar powers to Elle, and this correlates with the first scene of episode 1. You know, the one that I said came off like a scene from an episode of a superhero show. And surprisingly quickly, Elle finds her, and they have a conversation about their own ideologies and differences in powers. And as well as having conversations with each other, Kali teaches Eleven how to use her powers. And this comes complete with a training scene which completely rips off X-Men First Class. The only difference being, instead of her coach telling her to find the goodness in herself or something, she's being told to use her anger. In other words, I'm pretty sure this is how the dark side in Star Wars teaches the Force. She even rips off Darth Vader's Force choke. Now, seeing as this is ripping off elements from good guys who end up being villains, such as Magneto, Darth Vader, and to an extent Chappie, I had a feeling that this was going to foreshadow Elle's turn to the dark side. And that would have been a character twist that I never would have expected. But seeing as they didn't go through with it, it ultimately made this episode pointless. What makes this especially infuriating is that everything Eleven learned in this episode she could just as easily have figured out in 5 to 10 minutes. This episode just decided to pad it out into a full-length episode instead.
We need more money, Paul. I can't keep eating this garbage.
You know, I find it hard to believe that these guys are low on cash and somehow this guy is still able to afford to maintain his mohawk. Priorities, dude. Learn it or quit complaining. Also, as I briefly mentioned earlier, this really feels very reminiscent to the plot of the film Chappie, when an uneducated robot is being used for evil by these homeless-looking mohawk-wearing crooks, and I'm pretty sure Chappie took inspiration from Short Circuit too, so there is absolutely nothing original about this episode, so although it could have been interesting, it was predictable and nonsensical. It feels like the whole point of this episode was to set up a new spin-off show, and I do not want a dedicated show based on these characters. The general opinion on this episode is that it was bad, so here's hoping this kills off any ideas of these characters having their own show, because God knows I wouldn't want to watch it, and judging by the scores of the individual episodes, it looks like the rest of you guys wouldn't want to watch it either. So, it's happened. The first bad episode of Stranger Things. Let us never speak of it again. So we finally get the continuation that we should have got in the last episode, and this is exactly what I wanted to see. The Demogorgons break in and start to run amok, killing a ton of scientists who all might as well be wearing red shirts. And as well as being an awesome and action-packed episode, you can definitely see that the show's budget is a lot bigger because they could barely show just one of these things in the first season, let alone a handful of them. And this episode really utilizes the demidogs in the scariest and most intense set of circumstances for our main characters, and I love it now that the horror element has really kicked back into gear. The whole scene with Bob being guided through the facility is a perfect example of this. I think this is actually the most intense scene out of the whole show. I actually was under the impression that the doctor was going to guide him to the Demogorgons, but it turns out that he was legit. Bob still gets it though, and seeing him die wasn't nice. He actually became a likable character to me in this episode, and it actually makes me feel bad for not liking him this whole time, even though I was fully justified. Regardless, his death was well written and directed, and it will forever go down as a very memorable moment of the entire show. Also, am I the only one who finds it funny how Bob died in the first season and how Bob dies in this season? Two people with very similar names get introduced and die in their own respected season. I seriously doubt that is a coincidence. Anyway, that scene was great. It was also great to see this nutjob get his butt kicked, and it culminates wonderfully with Elle joining the group, and it is from here we move on to our final episode. So the episode opens with Elle being reunited with all her friends, and it was a very nice moment and such a relief. Truth be told, I honestly thought they were going to be reunited earlier on. I didn't know it was going to happen in the final episode of the season. Oh, and Elle notices that Dustin has grown his teeth since she last saw him.
You like these pearls?
Seriously, I can't get enough of this gag. And rightfully so, Mike is royally pissed off with Hopper for hiding her and not telling him that she was alive the whole time. And the acting from these two, especially from Mike here, is absolutely stellar. And Elle gets to meet Max for the first time face to face, and even though she hasn't done anything wrong, Eleven understandably doesn't like her. And down the line, this can cause for some friction between the two characters. And whilst all of this is happening, Billy comes to Mike's house to find Max, and we get this really awkward scene where Mike's mother is attracted to him. And I know that Billy is being manipulative and is sucking up to the adults, which is in keeping with the devious behavior of a bully, but what the heck is she doing? You're married, for crying out loud, woman. You know what, there's a lot of other things to talk about in this episode, and the less we say about this scene, the better. Going back to our main characters, they talk about what they are each going to do to put a stop to all of this. The portal to the Upside Down needs to be closed, and only Elle can do that, and Hopper is going to take her there. Joyce, on the other hand, gets the bright idea that if the thing inside Will likes the room temperature when it's cold, then if the room gets hot, Will's body will be uninhabitable for it, and the thing inside of him should get right out. So they do just that, and this scene was very painful to watch. The way Will is screaming in agony, and the way Jonathan is panicking, and just the way this whole scene is lit, and the way the characters are sweating, it really does feel kind of stressful to watch, and I gotta commend the show for being able to do that. You can tell this is the kind of atmosphere the showrunners wanted to go for in this scene, and they succeeded with flying colors. And they do end up getting the parasite out of him and have Will return back to normal. And as Hopper and Elle go to their destination, they have the most honest conversation I have seen between the two. It was serious, funny, and even emotional, and this is all in big part down to the writing and acting. And all in all, it was a very nice scene. And not only was it nice, it was...
Bitchin'.
Okay, sure. Bitchin'. So whilst all of that is going on, the rest of the kids come to the decision that they need to make a distraction for Elle because her mission leads her directly into the home of all the demi-dogs. Steve, however, tells them that he has been tasked with the responsibility to look after the little shits, so that is not happening. Right at that moment though, Max's brother shows up, and Steve tries to get rid of him, but you stupid kids. So he breaks in, and both him and Steve get in a fight, and just when Steve is about to get beaten to death, Max comes in and completely steals the show. So they take his car and leave, and Steve's reaction when he wakes up was absolutely priceless. In the end though, Dustin convinces him to help, and they all go through with the plan and set a big fire to attract all the demi-dogs to them. And in doing so, they free a path for Elle to close the gate. And it's quite the coincidence that of all the Demogorgons to find them first, it's Dot. Dustin gives him some nougat though, and it shows that it still remembers him. And we finally have Eleven who attempts to close the gate, all the whilst Hopper is doing some early Hellboy work. And you know things are getting super serious when Eleven has to use both her hands to channel her powers. And then she raises herself off the ground. I wonder if this is hinting at the fact that she may have more untapped powers at her disposal. That definitely raises some questions for season 3. So yeah, she closes the gate, and very much like the Phantom Menace, all the Demogorgons die, and the world is saved. We flash to 1 month later, Eleven has been given a birth certificate, courtesy of Dr. Owens, and Bob's parents find out that Bob is in fact dead. So, we see that the kids are getting ready for what looks like a prom at their school, and... Nice one, Max. And it was very nice and elderly brother-like of Steve to drive Dustin to the dance. He even gives him some advice.
Now you're gonna go in there.
Yeah.
You look like $1 million.
Yeah.
And you're gonna slam dead.
Like a lion.
Don't do that, okay?
Yes, someone had to tell him that. But yeah, this was a very nice scene. A highlight of this season really is the brotherly bond that both Dustin and Steve had throughout this season. And damn, I really felt sorry for Dustin. He tries to get a dance and they turn him down in the most horribly rejected way possible. I mean, it's enough to say no, but they laugh at him too. Even Nancy feels sorry for him. So she does something which I thought was actually really quite nice of her. She actually asks him to dance. And if that wasn't enough, she even says this to him.
No. Out of all my brother's friends, you're my favorite. You've always been my favorite.
Considering what she was like to him in season 1, this was a very nice development which shows how much they have changed since. The same goes for Dustin, because if you recall, after she closed the door on him back in season 1, he said this.
There's something wrong with your sister.
What are you talking about?
She's got a stick up her butt. She's turning into a real jerk.
She's always been a real jerk.
She used to be cool.
So that was nice and very elderly sister of her. And the episode ends with all the kids dancing, everything seems fine until we find out that this thing is still alive and it seems to be angry. So, what are my concluding thoughts on this season? Well, first things first, I liked its newest addition, which is Max. I wasn't sure where the show was going with her at the beginning of the season, but as it went on, she became a very likable new addition to the group of characters. Now granted, she didn't feel necessary to get the plot going, but the fact that she fits in so well with an already established group of characters should be commended, because we have all seen how horribly wrong it can feel when it's not done right. As for our other new character, I was surprised to find how much I liked Bob in the end. He really came into his own in that final episode and totally redeemed himself, and you still feel the weight of his death in the final episode. Nancy and Steve have also changed a lot since the first season. Nancy was a dumb teenager who had elements that were dangerously close to a typical horror movie slut, and Steve was the typical bully who thought he was so cool, and seeing them very well behaved in season 2 was probably the biggest surprise to me. Now in season 1, I really liked Jonathan as a character. You would sympathize with him, even though you would question his pervy trigger finger, and Steve acting like the typical bully and picking on him made you feel even more sorry for him, and you were really on his side. But ever since Steve became reformed, in season 2 he has taken the reins from Jonathan and has now replaced him as the really likable and sympathetic character. And I just found Jonathan to be pretty boring this season. I mean, he isn't bad or anything, but the whole arc of his character has come to an end in season 1 and he's pretty much got nothing left to do other than hook up with Nancy. Steve, however, is rapidly becoming a much better character, and getting him involved with the kids was an ingenious move. And giving him this role as an older brother, especially to Dustin, it really elevated his character and furthered his development in a way which I didn't expect. And I hear that he's going to get even more development in season 3, so I look forward to seeing that. In terms of character progression, none of the characters really changed throughout this season. When you take a look at the whole season from beginning to end, Hopper seems to be the only one that had a significant character arc. Everyone else is essentially the same as they already were when this season started. Now, the episode that I thought was completely tacked on is episode 7, The Lost Sister. The reason this episode was a horrible addition is because it didn't amount to anything. If something came of it, then it would hold some relevance, but unfortunately, it didn't. And it's a shame that a season that is this awesome will have this to taint its near-perfect streak. It was also rumoured that this episode was meant to set up a spin-off series, and I sure as hell am glad that didn't happen. So yeah, overall, I loved this season. It was interesting from beginning to end, and the arc that Eleven and Hopper go through, specifically Hopper, was the highlight of the show to me. And even if there was no evil supernatural stuff going on, I would still enjoy hanging out with these characters. Their interactions and day-to-day shenanigans is a lot of fun to watch, and when season 2 was over, I felt exactly the way I did when season 1 was over. I wanted to see more, and that's the sign of a truly great TV show. And Stranger Things season 2 gets a 9 out of 10. This was a really great season, and before anyone asks me to do a versus video of Stranger Things, because I know it will be on some of your minds, I'm sorry to say I won't be. So I'll just say right now, the season that I thought was slightly better is season 2. It just felt like a lot more stuff was going on, and the bigger budget of this season really made for some truly intense episodes, and I can't wait to see what happens next in season 3. So, that's it for another Let's Binge Watch video. I'm sorry it took so long. I initially planned for this video to be released last year, but I never got around to completing all of it. So, comment below and let me know what you think of Stranger Things, and also let me know which season is your favourite. And as always, if you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up, as it really does help in getting my channel noticed by YouTube's algorithm. Thank you so much as always for watching, guys, and I will catch all of you next time. Take care.